Halfway through the first test screening in Pasadena, a man in the third row stood up, pointed at the screen, and said Ron Howard's name loud enough for the entire theater to turn around. Listen closely, because what this stranger says next has nothing to do with the movie on the screen, and everything to do with a promise Ron made 15 years ago and quietly forgot. The screening had been going well, better than well actually. Ron was sitting in his usual spot, back row, far left corner, close enough to the exit that he could slip out if he needed to, but far enough from the crowd that nobody would recognize him in the dark. The theater smelled like artificial butter and carpet cleaner, that particular movie theater scent that always transported Ron back to his childhood, back to Saturday matinees, and the magic of watching stories unfold on screens bigger than houses. He'd been watching the audience more than the movie, the way he always did at test screenings, counting the laughs, noting when people shifted in their seats, when they reached for their drinks, when they leaned forward with interest, or slumped back with boredom, tracking the moments when the energy in the room dipped, and wondering if those were scenes he'd need to trim or reshape in the edit. 73 minutes into a 2-hour film, and so far the cards were looking good. The preview audience seemed engaged, their faces lit intermittently by the flickering glow of the screen. The studio rep sitting 2 rows ahead of Ron had stopped checking his phone, which was always a positive sign. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? Because wherever you are, I need you to understand what it feels like to sit in a dark theater and watch 2 years of your work unfold in front of strangers who will decide, with their little comment cards and their numbered ratings, whether your film lives or dies. The man who stood up was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, gray hair, neatly trimmed, a button-down shirt that looked like it had been ironed that morning. He didn't look like a troublemaker. He looked like someone's accountant, someone's neighbor, someone who had wandered into the wrong theater and suddenly realized his mistake. But the way he said Ron's name, the way he pronounced each syllable like it was a verdict, that wasn't the voice of someone who was lost. Here's the first thing I need you to hold on to. Who was this man? And how did he know Ron would be at this screening? I'll tell you. But first you need to understand what was at stake in that theater, beyond just the movie. The film was called The Long Way Home. It was a drama about a family torn apart by secrets and slowly rebuilt through forgiveness. The kind of story that lived or died on the strength of its performances and the truthfulness of its emotions. Ron had been developing it for almost 4 years, longer than any project he'd worked on in decades. The script had gone through 11 drafts, each one stripping away another layer of artifice until what remained felt raw and real and dangerously personal. The cast had changed 3 times before he found the right combination of faces and voices, actors who could carry the weight of silence as well as dialogue. The studio had nearly pulled the plug twice, first during pre-production when the budget ballooned past $30 million, and again during post when the first assembly came in 40 minutes too long, and the pacing felt like wading through honey. But Ron had fought for it. He'd put his reputation on the line, made promises to executives who trusted him, called in favors he'd been saving for years, because this film mattered to him in a way that was hard to explain to people who just saw it as another 2 hours of entertainment. This film was personal. This film was the reason he'd gotten into directing in the first place. Stop for a second and picture this theater from above. Because who sat where will matter more than you think. Ron was in the back left corner, flanked by his editor on one side and an empty seat on the other. The studio rep was 2 rows ahead, and to the right, close enough that Ron could see the glow of his phone when he checked it. The market research team was clustered near the middle exit, clipboards ready, waiting to intercept audience members after the credits rolled. And the man who had just stood up was in the 3rd row, almost directly in front of the screen, where the light from the projector caught his face and made his features hard to read. 47 minutes until the screening ended. 47 minutes until Ron could escape this room and find out what had just gone wrong. The man spoke again. louder this time, his voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. "Ron Howard, I know you're here. I know you're watching." The audience was turning now, heads swiveling like sunflowers tracking light, trying to figure out what was happening. The comfortable anonymity of the movie theater had been shattered. Someone in the middle section laughed nervously, the kind of laugh that escapes when you don't know how else to respond to something strange and uncomfortable. Someone else shushed them, still hoping this would pass, still wanting to go back to the movie. But the movie kept playing on the screen behind the man, actors delivering lines that suddenly seemed ridiculous against the backdrop of whatever this was becoming. The projector hummed overhead, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below. Ron's editor leaned over and whispered, his breath warm against Ron's ear, "Should we call security?" Ron shook his head. Not yet. He wanted to hear what this man had to say. Something about the situation felt important, felt like it demanded attention rather than dismissal. Notice what Ron does next, because it tells you everything about the kind of person he is under pressure. He didn't hide. He didn't pretend he wasn't there. He didn't send someone else to handle the situation. Instead, Ron Howard stood up in the back row of a test screening, in full view of 200 strangers who had just been watching his movie, and said, "I'm here. What do you need?" The theater went completely silent. Even the movie seemed to pause, though of course it kept running. Dialogue continuing, music swelling, the story unfolding for an audience that was no longer paying attention. The man in the third row turned to face the back of the theater, and in the dim light of the projection, Ron could finally see his face clearly. There was something familiar about it, something around the eyes, maybe, or the way he held his shoulders, but Ron couldn't place it. Not yet. "You don't remember me," the man said. It wasn't a question. "I didn't expect you to. It's been 15 years. Wait, because what happens in the next 3 minutes will determine whether this screening can be salvaged, whether this film can be saved, and whether Ron's reputation survives the night." Ron started walking down the aisle. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way you approach an unpredictable situation when you're not sure what you're dealing with. The audience watched him pass, 200 faces turning to follow his progress like spectators at a tennis match. The studio rep was already on his feet, phone pressed to his ear, probably calling someone who could make this problem disappear. But Ron wasn't thinking about the studio rep. He was thinking about the man in the third row, and the 15 years he'd mentioned, and the promise Ron apparently couldn't remember making. "Help me out," Ron said, when he reached the third row. He kept his voice calm, conversational, like they were two old friends, catching up at a party, instead of two strangers, having a confrontation in front of 200 witnesses. 15 years is a long time. Where did we meet? The man's face shifted into something that might have been a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Cedar Rapids, 2009. You were doing a publicity tour for that racing movie. I waited outside the hotel for 6 hours to talk to you. Remember this moment, because it's the second thing I need you to hold on to. What happened in Cedar Rapids 15 years ago? And what promise did Ron make that he'd forgotten? Ron searched his memory. 2009. The racing movie. That would have been Rush, the Formula One film he'd spent 3 years making. He remembered the publicity tour. Dozens of cities in a handful of weeks. Interviews blurring together. Faces passing by faster than he could process them. Cedar Rapids wasn't a major stop, but he'd been there. He'd been to a lot of places that year. "I remember Cedar Rapids," Ron said carefully, "but I'm sorry, I don't remember meeting you. What's your name?" "David Weston." The man said it like the name should mean something, like it should unlock a door in Ron's memory and let all the details come flooding back. But nothing came. The name meant nothing. The face meant nothing. Whatever had happened in Cedar Rapids 15 years ago, Ron had no recollection of it. Listen closely now, because the film is still playing. 41 minutes left until the end credits roll. And every second this confrontation continues, is a second that the market research team can't do their jobs. The audience is getting restless. The studio rep is getting nervous, and Ron Howard is standing in the third row of a test screening, trying to understand why a stranger has chosen this moment, this place, to demand something from him. "I had a son," David Weston said. His voice cracked on the word had, and something in Ron's chest tightened like a fist closing around his heart. His name was Michael. He was 17 years old, and he wanted to be a filmmaker more than he wanted anything else in the world. More than sports, more than girls, more than anything a normal teenager cares about. He used to stay up until 3 in the morning, watching old movies, taking notes, trying to understand how they worked. "When we heard you were coming to Cedar Rapids, he begged me to take him to meet you. He had a script he'd written, 40 pages, handwritten on notebook paper, about a boy who builds a spaceship in his backyard and accidentally makes contact with an alien civilization. He wanted to show it to you. He wanted to know if it was any good. He wanted you to tell him if his dream was worth chasing." The theater was so quiet now that Ron could hear the projector humming overhead, could hear the soft rustle of someone shifting in their seat 3 rows away. On the screen behind David, a scene was playing that Ron had spent 3 weeks shooting, a father and daughter reconciling after years of estrangement. The irony wasn't lost on him. Before we go any further, you need to understand something about the life Ron Howard had been living in 2009. He was at the peak of his career, or what felt like the peak at the time. He'd won an Oscar for A Beautiful Mind. He directed some of the most successful films of the decade, and he was exhausted in a way that's hard to explain to people who haven't experienced that level of constant, unrelenting demand. Every day there were more requests than hours, more people who wanted something from him than he could possibly give to, more opportunities to disappoint someone, to let someone down, to fail to be the version of himself that everyone seemed to need him to be. "I remember now," Ron said quietly, and he did, not the boy, not the script, not the face, but he remembered the feeling of that tour, the crushing weight of being wanted by everyone and having nothing left to give. Hold this moment in your mind, because when we come back to it at the end, you won't see Ron the same way again. David Weston was waiting for something, an explanation, an apology, something that would make the last 15 years make sense. "What happened?" Ron asked. "After Cedar Rapids, what happened to Michael?" David's face contorted into something between grief and anger. "You told him you'd read his script. You said you'd give him notes, that you'd help him understand what worked and what didn't. You gave him an address to send it to some production company office in Los Angeles. He mailed it the next day. And then he waited." Ron felt the weight of what was coming before David said it. He felt it in his bones, in his stomach, in the place where he kept all the things he'd rather not remember. He waited 6 months. No response. He wrote letters. He called the office. Nothing. And then one day, he just stopped. Stopped writing. Stopped talking about movies. Stopped being the kid I knew. David's voice broke completely now, tears streaming down his face in the light of the projector. He's 32 now. He works in insurance. He hasn't written a word in 15 years. And every time I see him, I think about that day in Cedar Rapids when he believed that someone he admired was going to help him, and how that belief got crushed into nothing because you couldn't be bothered to keep your promise. 34 minutes until the end credits. 34 minutes until the market research team would be collecting comment cards that would determine the fate of this film. And Ron Howard was standing in the third row of a dark theater, being held accountable for something he barely remembered doing. Wait, because this isn't really a story about a broken promise. This is a story about what happens when the person you've become meets the person you used to be, and that meeting is almost never comfortable. The audience was shifting now. Some of them were uncomfortable, looking away, wishing they hadn't witnessed this private confrontation. Others were leaning forward, phones already out, probably recording. The studio rep had stopped talking on his phone and was watching with an expression that mixed concern and calculation. Concern for Ron, calculation about how this would affect the film's release. Ron took a deep breath. Everything he said next would be heard by 200 people who had no stake in this conversation except curiosity. Everything he did would be remembered, analyzed, potentially uploaded to the internet before he even left the theater. But none of that mattered as much as the man standing in front of him, the man whose son had lost something precious because Ron had been too busy, too tired, too overwhelmed to keep a promise that had probably taken him 2 seconds to make. Notice how Ron doesn't try to defend himself. He doesn't explain the pressures he was under. He doesn't rationalize or minimize or shift the blame. Watch what he does instead. "You're right," Ron said. The 2 words dropped into the silence, like stones into still water. "I don't remember your son. I don't remember his script. I made a promise I didn't keep, and I have no excuse for that." He paused, meeting David's eyes directly. "I'm sorry. That's not enough, but it's all I have. I'm sorry." The theater seemed to hold its breath. On the screen behind them, the movie continued. A scene where the main character finally admits that he's been lying to himself for years. Ron had written that scene. He'd directed it. He'd never imagined he'd be living it. David Weston stared at Ron for a long moment. The anger was still there, but something else was creeping in around the edges. Something like exhaustion. Something like the deflation that comes when you finally confront something you've been carrying for years and discover that the confrontation doesn't fix anything. "Before we continue, I need you to understand something about apologies that most people never think about. An apology isn't magic. It doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't heal the wound. It doesn't give Michael Weston back the 15 years he spent not writing, not creating, not being the person he might have become. All an apology does is acknowledge reality. It says, this happened, it was wrong, and I was the one who did it. That's valuable, but it's not enough. And Ron knew it wasn't enough, even as he said the words. "I don't want your apology," David said. His voice was steadier now, colder. "I want you to understand what you took from him. I want you to sit in this theater and watch your movie, and think about all the movies Michael will never make because you couldn't be bothered to read 40 pages. 27 minutes until the end credits. The film was entering its 3rd act now, the part where everything comes together, where the threads that have been woven throughout the story finally begin to converge into something meaningful. Ron had spent months in the editing room getting this section right. He'd fought with the studio about pacing, about music choices, about which moments to hold and which to cut, and now none of it mattered, because David Weston was standing in front of him, demanding a payment that Ron couldn't possibly make. Listen to what Ron says next, because this is the moment that separates who he is from who he could have been. "You're right," Ron said again. "An apology isn't enough. It doesn't fix what I broke." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, plain white, his name and a phone number, nothing else. "This is my personal number, not an office, not an assistant. Me. Give it to Michael. Tell him to call me. Tell him I want to read his script." David looked at the card like it was a snake that might bite him. "It's been 15 years. He doesn't write anymore." "Then tell him I want to talk. Tell him I want to hear about the movie he would have made if I hadn't let him down." Ron pressed the card into David's hand. "I can't give him back the 15 years, but maybe I can give him something else. Maybe I can give him someone who finally listens. Remember the 3 questions I opened at the beginning of this story? Now watch how they close, one by one in reverse order." The 3rd question was about what was at stake beyond the movie. The answer: Ron's integrity, his ability to look at himself in the mirror and believe that he was still the person he thought he was, someone who cared about young filmmakers, someone who remembered what it felt like to be starting out, someone who would never crush a dream just because he was too busy to pay attention. David Weston had forced him to confront the gap between the person he wanted to be and the person he had actually been in that hotel lobby in Cedar Rapids, and that confrontation, painful as it was something Ron needed. The second question was about the promise Ron had forgotten. The answer was both simple and devastating. He had told a 17-year-old boy that his dream mattered, and then he had let that promise evaporate into the noise of his busy, successful, endlessly demanding life. It wasn't malice. It wasn't cruelty. It was something worse: indifference. The kind of indifference that comes from having too much power and too little time. The kind that leaves wreckage behind without even noticing. The first question was about who David Weston was, and how he knew Ron would be there. The answer came later, after the screening ended, after the comment cards were collected, after David had taken the business card and walked out of the theater without another word. Ron asked the market research team how David had gotten in. They checked the guest list. David Weston had signed up for the screening through the normal channels, the same online recruitment process they used for every test audience. He'd seen an ad, clicked a link, answered some questions about his movie preferences. He'd had no idea Ron Howard would be there until he walked into the theater and saw the title card on the screen. His confrontation hadn't been planned. It had been fate, or coincidence, or whatever you want to call it when the universe decides to hold you accountable for something you thought you'd gotten away with. The screening ended 22 minutes after David left. The audience filed out, some of them looking back at Ron with expressions that ranged from sympathy to curiosity to judgment. The market research team collected their cards. The studio rep approached Ron with a tablet full of preliminary numbers, talking about scores and demographics and what all of it meant for the release strategy. But Ron wasn't listening. He was thinking about Michael Weston, 32 years old now, selling insurance somewhere in Iowa, carrying a wound that Ron had inflicted without even knowing it. Notice what happens in the weeks after that screening. The film tested well despite the interruption. The studio moved forward with the release. Critics were positive. Audiences were warm. And The Long Way Home became one of the most successful dramas of Ron's career. But none of that is really the story. The story is what happened next. 3 weeks after the screening, Ron's phone rang. The sound cut through the quiet of his home office like an alarm. He didn't recognize the number, a 319 area code, Iowa, but he answered anyway. He'd been answering every unfamiliar call since that night in Pasadena, just in case. Just hoping. "Mr. Howard?" The voice was hesitant, uncertain, carrying the weight of someone who had rehearsed what they wanted to say but forgotten it all in the moment. "This is Michael Weston. My dad said you wanted to talk." Ron sat down in his office, looking out the window at the lot below. Crews moving equipment, actors walking to their trailers, grips and gaffers going about their work. The constant motion of a business that never stopped needing things from the people inside it. He thought about the 17-year-old who had waited outside a hotel in Cedar Rapids with 40 handwritten pages and a dream. He thought about the 32-year-old on the other end of the phone who had given up on that dream because someone he admired had let him down. "I did," Ron said. "I want to hear about your spaceship movie, the one you wrote when you were 17. I want to know everything about it." The line was quiet for a long moment. Then Michael Weston laughed. A small sound, surprised, like he'd forgotten how to do it. "That script was terrible. I was 17. I didn't know what I was doing." "Tell me about it anyway," Ron said. "I've got time." And Ron Howard? He kept directing. He kept making films that reached millions of people and earned billions of dollars and won awards that sat on shelves in his office. But something had changed after that night in Pasadena. He started responding to every letter from young filmmakers personally. He started taking meetings with film students who had no connections, no representation, no reason to expect that someone like him would give them an hour. He started remembering that every promise matters, even the small ones, especially the small ones, because you never know which promise is the one that holds someone's future in its hands. Michael Weston never became a filmmaker. That ship had sailed too long ago. And some dreams don't come back once you've let them go. But he started writing again, short stories at first, then longer pieces, then a novel that took him 3 years to finish. When it was published, there was a dedication in the front. For my father, who never stopped believing, and for Ron Howard, who finally listened. Here's the final question I want to leave you with. How many promises have you made that you don't remember? How many people are carrying something you gave them, good or bad, that you've completely forgotten? We all do this. We all move through the world, leaving marks on people that we never see. The question isn't whether we can avoid it. The question is what we do when someone shows up, years later, and holds us accountable. Ron Howard got lucky that night in Pasadena. He got a chance to make something right that he didn't even know was wrong. Most of us don't get that second chance. Most of us never find out about the damage we've done or the gifts we've given. That's the story of what happened at the test screening in Pasadena. The night a stranger stood up in the 3rd row and reminded Ron Howard that every word matters, every promise counts, and sometimes the most important audience isn't the 200 people watching your movie. Sometimes it's the one person you forgot. The one person who believed you when you made a promise you didn't keep. The one person whose dream you accidentally crushed without even realizing what you'd done. If this meant something to you, tell me in the comments below. And if you want to hear what happened the night Ron walked away from a film entirely because of what he saw in an actor's eyes, let me know. That story's been waiting a long time to be told.